So we already know that these comets then are leftovers. They're formed on the outer part of our solar system, and if they come close enough to the sun, they end up kind of creating these beautiful things in our nighttime sky that move across the sky as they orbit the sun. But in general, we say comets are located in the outer part of our solar system in one of two regions. They're located in the Kuiper Belt, and remember, the Kuiper Belt is basically if you take the plane of the ecliptic, and drawn here for your convenience is that blue line is the blue line is Neptune's orbit. So basically kind of take Neptune's orbit and go outward in the plane of the ecliptic, and that's the Kuiper Belt. And so these Kuiper Belt objects, or these Kuiper Belt comets, they orbit the sun in the same direction that the planets orbit the sun. And sometimes, by the way, these are called KBOs, Kuiper Belt objects. The other place that comets can be located is in a region even farther than the Kuiper Belt called the Oort cloud. Now the Oort cloud, kind of think of a big old sphere of comets out there buzzing around our solar system, centered on the sun. So these comets orbit the sun too, but they're random as far as their direction. So these Oort cloud comets, in other words, are even farther than the Kuiper Belt comets, which is pretty darn far beyond Neptune's orbit. Okay, so in general, we kind of think of the Kuiper Belt comets coming from that, remember that kind of the planetary disk during the nebular theory, kind of leftovers out there. And then the Oort cloud comets we think used to be closer, but they were kind of kicked out. And so they kind of have this faraway spherical sort of distribution, and they're going in all directions. So Pluto's orbit, we're going to talk about Pluto a little bit, because as it turns out, Pluto, instead of being a planet, generally it's what we would call a Kuiper Belt object, because remember the Kuiper Belt kind of begins at Neptune and kind of goes outward. Pluto just doesn't fit with the other four Jovian planets. If you look at Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune, you know, all the gaseous planets there, and then you got Pluto. Another thing about Pluto is its orbit is the most inclined of all of the 8 planets. Its orbit does not line what we call the plane of the ecliptic. It is true that Neptune is sometimes further out in its orbit than Pluto is, and so there is an intersection there, but like the slide says, rest assured the two planets will never run into each other. So as you know, Pluto now is not considered a planet. Pluto is significantly smaller than Mercury. And like I said, it kind of misses the whole 4 terrestrials, 4 Jovian, and then Pluto sort of pattern. And it's really much more like one of those comets that we see out there in the Kuiper Belt. Okay, so it has more in common with being a comet than it does with a major planet. And actually, kind of the beginning of its demise was in 2005, when an astronomer came up with a project, and he said, hey, I guess I will look at those Kuiper Belt objects, or I'll look in that region beyond Pluto and see what else I can find. Is there another planet-like object out there? And sure enough, he found Eris. As it turns out, and you see dysnomia is actually orbits the object Eris. And so in 2005, and I think this is why he called it Eris, Eris is like the god of strife. And so here we have this object that is going to have to be, what, the 10th planet? Okay, it's an object beyond Pluto. At this time, Pluto was still a planet. Okay, so Eris is even larger than Pluto. So kind of drawn to scale here, we see Eris that was found in 2005, Pluto and one of its moons, Charon. These other objects are kind of, well, maybe these next 2 objects are Kuiper Belt objects also. and maybe they're all Kuiper Belt objects. Down here, Cirrus, we've talked about Cirrus recently in Chapter 9, is one of those, is a belt asteroid. Okay, so in 2005 then, they found something larger than Pluto that orbits the sun, and so there you go. So if we kind of map the Kuiper Belt objects, are mapped in white here, you can see that in the center is the sun, and we see Eris kind of making this the red orbit, and Pluto is kind of a tan orbit, and our last Jovian planet, Neptune, is a blue color there. And if you remember, actually, when Pluto was recategorized as a dwarf planet, because one of the conditions to be a planet was that the object must have cleared its orbit. So actually, let me go ahead and highlight this for you. The fact that there are basically what we now call Kuiper Belt objects on Pluto's orbit. Can you kind of see? Here's Pluto's orbit. Okay, and the fact that it did not clear its orbit, this is why it failed the planet test. Okay, so there you go. And Eris obviously has not cleared its orbit. And both Eris and Pluto are much more like comets, these icy, rocky objects, than they are like even the terrestrial planets, but let alone the gaseous planets, ending with Neptune. So a year later, we're kicking this around. What do we do? Do we have now a 10th planet, Eris, or do we redefine what a planet is? And the Astronomical Union went with redefining what a planet is, or clearly defining, I guess I should say. So ever since then, Pluto now fits into a category called a dwarf planet. Also in that category are Cirrus and I believe Vesta, which are the two largest asteroids in the asteroid belt. And Eris is also a dwarf planet. So let's look at Pluto. Pluto is a dwarf planet, and it's got a relatively large moon, Charon, and actually Charon is almost as large as the dwarf planet Pluto. Pluto is very cold and has a thin nitrogen atmosphere. So in I think the summer 2011 and now the summer 2012 actually, instead of just when your book came out having 3 moons, I mentioned Charon is a moon that orbits Pluto. We have Nix and Hydra. This is a figure from your textbook. Now we know that at this point, according to the Hubble Space Telescope, who's taking these photographs, Pluto is up to 5. Count them, 5 moons. So here's a Hubble Space Telescope photograph. We have Pluto, Charon, Nix, Hydra. P4 was found summer 2011, and P5 was found just this past summer 2012. Okay, so it's definitely a dwarf planet system. Oh yeah, NASA has this spacecraft called New Horizons, and it is on its way to study Pluto. So how cool is that? And of course NASA's great. It's like a proud mama that keeps track of her projects. And so this is a website for New Horizons that's on its way to Pluto and other Kuiper Belt objects. And looks like July 2015 is the expected time of arrival. I mean, how totally cool is that? Well, speaking of comets, in 1994, a comet called Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet actually had fragmented earlier, and the pieces fell through, I think that's right, but the pieces fell through Jupiter's atmosphere and created this kind of chain of pieces. Isn't this cool? So the way it went down is that people were knew that in '94 this was going to happen. So I think they got some really good scientific information about looking at this interaction. And also then, this is a photograph of the surface of Callisto, which is one of the Galilean moons that orbit Jupiter. And you can kind of see this, this where the comet was impacted the moon and kind of sent this sort of chain, crater chain.